Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for another inner hour. Appreciate that. Just invite you to take a brief moment to kind of pause and let go of the day or the week or whatever else that may be disturbing or distracting you, and just allow yourself to rest for the next hour and be present here with us in this spirit. Alrighty, so we're continuing. I think all of you have been here before, but we're continuing in the Women in the Original Jesus Movement series. So I have a few more things to share with you tonight, and then also I mentioned last week that if we have time, I'll share kind of some new controversial discovery that's been made that connects to Yeshua and his family. Maybe if we don't have time for that this week, we'll get to it next week. But so I wanted to start with just a few. We kind of alluded to some of the things, the roles that women had in the. Okay, so can everybody hear me? Because I got a couple notes that somebody can't. Ani, can you hear me on your computer? Can anybody hear me?
I can hear you just fine. Sorry, I had to figure out how to get my.
Perfect. All right, so if you can't hear me, you probably have the volume on your computer or device turned down. Thank you, the others that are letting me know. So it seems like people can hear fine. So if you're not hearing me, um, and I can't tell you how to do it because you can't hear me, but turn on your own volume, get your own volume up. All right, let me see if I can answer this person a second here. And alrighty, uh-oh. Are you still hearing me, Ani?
I can still hear you, sure.
Okay, all right. So anyway, good. So I hope the other person can figure out what's going on in their computer so that they can't hear, so that they can hear. Uh, anyway, tonight I want to just give you a little bit more background on the role of women in general in that era, in that Jesus era, and that all it would have been true of all of the women that we've talked about so far. Just kind of context if you're interested in this sort of stuff. So first of all, at that time in Israel, it was almost exclusively an agricultural society. Most people's income was tied to that, and most life was rural. There were very small villages and a couple of larger cities, but predominantly was not a metropolitan life. In the Greek areas and the Roman areas, that was not true. Many more metropolises and things in the Greek and Roman areas, but not really in Jewish. Also, just so you know, during the Roman occupation, the taxes were super high. They typically took at least 50% of every household's income, at least. So people were really struggling, most of them financially. So as far as the women goes, and men too, I guess, this little piece, as far as age goes, because we know from almost all sources, including the Bible, that Mary, the mother of Jesus, was quite young when she bore him, more than likely in her early teen years. And so at that time, when young boys reach the age of 13, they became what was called a son of the commandment, and they went through a particular ritual called the bar mitzvah, and they actually had adult responsibilities, could enter into contracts, could enter into marriage at 13, could apprentice in their father's business or someone else's business. Girls also at that year were eligible to marry, believe it or not, and many did. And typically marriages were arranged. And once they were arranged, the couple was considered betrothed, but the tradition was that the marriage was not consummated until the first night of the wedding feast, and the wedding feast was traditionally 7 days long, a full week long. Wealthier women had a lot of privileges and opportunities that what we would call middle class, but they didn't have such a thing. The lower income people did not have much more time for one thing, many more resources, and they also had opportunities to study and learn and read and write, which most women didn't. Um, Women were allowed in the synagogue, but only in a certain room, and they could listen to the talks that were being presented in the Torah studies, but they could not participate in them, and they couldn't hold their own. They could just be in a room where they could hear what the men were doing during services, at least not really during the inner study times, but during the services, Shabbat services and festivals and so on. Um, Unlike today, we don't really have anything comparable to this. Life then was organized around the synagogues. And just to make a clear distinction, the temple, there was one temple, which was the temple in Jerusalem, which was the nationwide temple. And then local communities had what were called synagogues, which is actually a Greek word. It's called Knesset in Hebrew. The Greek word synagogue means a place of assembly or gathering together. So these were houses of study and prayer, where people would study Torah, would study the prophets, would engage in prayer, would do the various Jewish rituals for the feast days, festivals, Sabbath, and so on. And so community life was organized around that. People typically went to the synagogue at least twice a day, often 3 times a day. And men had many requirements that they had to do certain things with certain sacrificial offerings 3 times a year at the temple in Jerusalem, at their local synagogues, participating in various things. Many of the Jewish commandments women were exempt from, not all of them, but many of them. And many of the rabbis say that's because women were naturally much more spiritual than men and didn't need all the training. I kind of like that version, but on a practical level, it was because men worked at a trade or in the fields or whatever they did, basically from the sun came up till the sun went down, more or less, except on Shabbat. And women worked all the time, like nonstop. If they were awake, they were working. I mean, that's not much of an exaggeration. So what did they do? They raised the children, not the men. I mean, not that the men were not involved at all, but it was primarily the responsibility of the women. The household was the responsibility of the women. The household were responsible for children's education, for their spiritual education, for teaching them their faith, for teaching them its moral values, for teaching them the practices and rituals like the Shabbat ritual of candle lighting and various things like kosher diet and all of that. Marriage and family life was central to Judaism at the time, actually still is in most places. Very, very central and very highly revered. The role of a woman as a mother was very highly respected and revered in this time in Israel, in a way that probably a lot of women today, especially non-Jewish women, just would have trouble maybe even relating to. But it was very very honored position. Mothers, for the most part, are the ones who named their children. It was rare for a father to do that. Women were also the doctors and healers and physicians and medical specialists. They dealt with wounds and injuries and illness. They were midwives and delivered the children for other women. Women were restricted from entering the temple in Jerusalem during their menses, and they had purification rituals they had to do related to that before they could rejoin the community. And during that time, men, including their husbands, were not allowed to touch them, not just have sex with them, but touch them even. One of the reasons that culturally men did not touch women in public was because you couldn't touch a woman who was during her menses. And so if you were avoiding touching a particular woman, but you could touch other women, then everybody would know she was on her period. And so to protect her modesty, so you never knew because you didn't touch any of them. So that was something back then. While we often think of veils in association with Islam nowadays, veils were very common in Israel for women during that time, and actually were required for married women to wear in public at that time. It was considered a symbol of modesty and a symbol of virtue. It also indicated marital status in many regions of Israel. Perhaps all, I'm not sure, but it was common. The Jewish rabbis or Jewish teachers did not have women students. They did not converse with women in public. Women conversed with women in public. So for Yeshua to have women in his crowd of followers, for them to be able to talk with him, to ask him questions, for him to touch them, to do healing, or to hug them, which he's reported as doing, and let alone take them as actual students where they could study with him, learn to read and write, study Torah, study the prophecies. That was just unheard of, and one of the things that did not make him real popular with people. The houses back then that most people lived in were very small, typically one room. Sometimes there would be a separate bedroom in the house. Almost always a dirt floor, compacted dirt floor that typically had mats over it, and they would have very low, small tables that they would eat off of, sitting on the mats, and those mats also often doubled as their beds. Sometimes they'd put like a straw or something, and a blanket over it for more padding or more warmth. They're typically made of the houses typically made of stone because there was so much stone available, and or dried mud. Because it was so hot in most parts of Israel, they spent very little time indoors. Actually, they typically cooked outside, although they had a small fireplace inside. Usually, they could cook in bad weather, but most cooking was done. Like if you've ever been in the deep south, like Louisiana, the Bayou, southern Mississippi. Cooking outside is a big deal. That's what they do. They did that in Israel too. They cooked outside, they ate outside, pretty much inside only in inclement weather. They lived outside, their trades were largely outside. And the roof, most of the buildings had flat roofs, and the rooftop was a leisure area, also cooler in the evening than being inside this house that had collected heat all day long. So sometimes they slept on the roof. They often entertained on the roof. They often socialized on the roof, and so on. So women also did laundry, of course, and cooking, which I haven't mentioned, but and cooking wasn't turning on a stove back then. Obviously, they had to collect the wood or whatever they were using to fire with charcoal, whatever it might have been. They were responsible for the animals. Typically, homes had chickens, doves. They often had sheds. They often had small animal shelters, stables of some kind for goats, donkeys, sheep, whatever it may have been. And I don't mean flocks of sheep, those were in pastures. They almost always had a ladder that led to the roof so that people could get up there. Children played up there as well. They typically only had one door that entered directly to the street. And they had windows, but the windows were not like we think of. They were just open holes in the wall. And were often had wooden shutters that they could close from the inside, but they didn't have windows or glass or anything like that. A typical day began at sunrise, and women would have to go to the village well to collect all the water that they needed for cooking, bathing, medical, whatever it may have been. So heavy, hard, laborious work. They typically in the morning would eat cheese and bread. That was a kind of and if they had it, fruit like figs and dates, olives. They did have a marketplace in most villages that was open a few days a week, not always, and people could gather supplies, staples, foods, and whatnot that they needed there that they couldn't create for themselves. And then typically those streets had other shops, shoe shops, clothing shops, different kinds of things that they might need, blacksmith, carpenters, that sort of thing. Women baked bread, which was a big staple at the time of their diet. Their typical diet, by the way, included bread, the fruits that I mentioned, fish, particularly in the areas around Galilee. Um, they also preserved and salted fish and could ship them to different places. Beans, they did a lot of legumes, beans, lentils, um, a lot of leeks and onions, cucumbers were common. Nuts of many kinds were common. Melons, believe it or not, and grapes, of course. Grapes and pomegranates are two fruits I didn't mention were really common. Uh, they did not have or use sugar, but they did use honey for sweeteners. Women made most of the family's clothing and actually spun from raw wool. That was something women learned how to do. Of course, they learned how to sew and mend. Typically, people had an inner garment and then an outer, longer garment that went over that, both men and women. The tunic and the mantle is how they're generally referred to in the Bible. Girls were not educated outside the home. They did not go to schools. They did not study Torah. They did not learn to read and write. I mentioned before that women were exempt from a lot of religious observances because they were so essential in the livelihood of the family and its surviving in the household that they really didn't have time. So many of those requirements they were exempted from. So again, the idea that Yeshua had women in his inner circle was rare, and that was another way in which, while it's not talked about very often, he was very, very much not conforming to social norms at the time by doing that. So anyway, that's just a bit more about just everyday kind of life with women and what they did. And again, nobody except the really wealthy had, they all had very, very small homes, typically one room, or sometimes, like I said, a separate bedroom, sometimes for the children, or maybe an elder who now needed to be cared for by the family. And so the elder parent or grandparent would live in that extra room. The wealthy women, of course, and we've talked to some of them, had much more spacious houses. Some of them in this era built on Roman design, with an atrium in the middle and the house going around it, basically an open courtyard in the middle. And some were not like that, but they were multi-roomed, and many of them, because of the terrain, again, mostly built of stone, but many of them were multi-level, not like second, third floor like we would think of necessarily, although in some cases, but more like, step down or up a few steps to get into different sections of the house to kind of accommodate the terrain for the builders. And then also something we haven't talked about, but ritual purity was very important. And there's something called mikvot or mikvah. And a mikvah was a place that they could do ritual purifications in water, which is where Christian baptism kind of evolved out of that. The mikvah was not a place to bathe and get clean. You already had to be clean to go into the mikvah. And the mikvah had to not be an enclosed, still body of water. It had to have an inlet and an outlet. And so many had like pools that came in from a river and routed part of it in and then back out. Wealthy homes, might have mikvahs built in them that the water could flow in and through, because they did have plumbing in many of the wealthier homes, particularly the ones after the Romans came in. And then the communities, every community had a community mikvah as well, where there would be several of these baths that both men and women, not together, not like in Japan, men separately, women separately, would go through these various purifications for certain Jewish rituals and observances that involved the mikveh. And that was an important part of their life as well. And gradually that idea of purification, and if, for example, somebody converted, they had to go through a mikveh. The idea of being in a moving, flowing body of water, again, sort of representing the movement of spirit of the divine through us, and the idea of immersing yourself in that to be ritually cleansed and purified was later kind of amended and adopted into Christian practice in what we call baptism, which initially, in early Christianity, once it began to be divorced from Judaism, was a full immersion in a living body of water, and later began to be immersion inside a church, and then later began to be like little sprinkles on your head kind of a thing, you know. But Jews never sprinkled anybody's head like that, so there was a full immersion. So I want to pause just a minute, and if there's any, without going into a greater in-depth study than I really want to do with any of these individual women, I've kind of shared what I wanted to, so if you want, you can find out more about them. And tonight, I'll also tell you some places you can look for more information if you want to. But just with what's been said so far, has there been any questions that you had that you didn't get to ask, or anything that maybe you were really interested in knowing about some of the women I've talked about that I haven't mentioned that you would like to ask? Just, we can take a few moments and do that. And if there isn't, we'll move to the next part of tonight. So Ani, go ahead.
I'm just wondering if you have any plans to speak any more in depth about Mary Magdalene's journey from whoever she was originally into the bad girl, and how that came about, why that came about. And I don't know if you have that already planned or not. I thought it was interesting that Easter weekend we watched Jesus Christ Superstar again, and I watched it for 20 years probably, and it's an interesting take. Number one, their take on the temple. I'm not sure where they got that. That was kind of weird. I mean, there was a lot of that was very considered at the time groundbreaking and unusual and all that stuff, and they got a lot of kudos and flack both for it. But even there, they were, when Judas is singing about her, about it's not that he objects to her profession, and it's like, whoa, that. So I don't know. Just if you have any comments or not about that.
Yeah, okay, good, thanks. Yeah, I had mentioned this kind of briefly before. First of all, the reality is we don't know much about her background. There's a lot of more speculation than evidence for any of her background. The idea that she was a prostitute, or a loose woman at least, the idea that she hung out in bars and gambled and drank herself blind and had sex with everybody, or had sex for money, or both, was a much, much later addition, and that the Catholic Church added. Absolutely does not appear in the Bible, and they were, as I said, one of the popes. I should look up who it is because I never remember. I want to say Pope Innocent, but I don't want to malign him if it's the wrong one. But you can look it up historically. It's easy to find. They were very much stressing celibacy, and as you can imagine, at various times in the history of the Catholic Church, celibacy was not popular, and so they kind of had to reinforce and reemphasize it. And in this one age, when they were doing that, the Pope decided that he wanted to draw a clear distinction between the type of woman a woman should be and the type of woman she should not be. So he picked Mary the Mother as this holy, chaste, perpetual virgin that all women should be. I don't know how he thinks the race would carry on, but that they should all be that, and contrasted that with Mary Magdalene, because there is some indication in the Bible that she was at one time the woman talked about being possessed by demons. There was no sex stuff involved with that or prostitution or that, but there was a woman he healed of demons, and some people believed that that was Mary Magdalene, although it doesn't say that. Could have been a completely different woman. So the church kind of picked up on that and figured since she was possessed, she was probably into drugs and alcohol and illicit sex and everything else. And elaborated on that to make this clear distinction. It was 100% false, and they knew that at the time. And since then, the Catholic Church, in our era, I want to say John Paul II. I'm not a Catholic and I don't follow it that closely, but one of the recent popes, not the newest one, discounted all that and apologized and said that was absolutely false. So we don't know much about it. There are early oral stories that she actually was a high priestess and a prophet, considered a prophet in her region, like the wife of Isaiah was considered a prophet. So, was she or wasn't she? We don't really know. And again, her name, Magdalene, comes from Magdala, which is also confusing because it was a fishing village where they did a lot of the preparation and salting and preserving of fish and shipped it to various parts of Israel. So does it mean she came from there? Because sometimes they're named by where they came from. That's what's been traditionally thought for a long time. More and more scholars are shifting to a different opinion, which was a very early one also, was that it came from Migdal, which means tower, and that she was considered like a pillar, exactly the opposite of prostitute. She was considered like a pillar of virtue and integrity and spiritual wisdom, and that's why she was called Magdala. But again, we don't really know. So pick the one you like best. As they're discovering more things, which they continue to do archaeologically, maybe more of that picture will come together. I certainly prefer to think of her as in the more elevated role, and I think that's more likely given the respect she had in the non-canonical Gospels, like in the Gospel of Matthew and Philip and others, and her own Gospel, Mary Magdalene's Gospel, that the status she held in Jesus' eyes, and therefore the eyes of his close followers, more likely that it was the tower of integrity and wisdom kind of a thing. Yeah, so also with that, I want to tell you briefly again, just recount very briefly, and it'll come to Lois, that there are traditions that after the crucifixion, that she was in fact married to Yeshua, that at the crucifixion she was pregnant with their first child, only child, and that Joseph of Arimathea, who was a great uncle of Yeshua's, and a very wealthy merchant by all accounts, and a very powerful man in Rome and in Israel, took Mary Magdalene with him to southern England, where he'd been a number of times because he owned tin mines there. He'd taken Yeshua there too when Yeshua was a teenager, by the same account, and for her safety. And then eventually took her to the Provence area of southern France, where she settled down in relative obscurity except for a few trusted people. She had other women, close women she trusted with her, and a couple of men, and gave birth to the child. And that changes too. Some say it was a son named Judah, and some say it was a daughter named Sarah, and we don't have a lot of evidence of that. So, we don't know. There are also stories of that son then going back to England and raising a family, and that bloodline, which was Yeshua's, actually ended up going into the royal family of England. all of that's really shady historically, but very old legends and pretty persistent, and they're in a number of places. So, uh, a lot of intrigue and a lot of uncertainty. So anyway, back to Lois. Go ahead, Lois. And if you can unmute, there you go.
Okay. Two questions.
Mhm.
You're talking about the women.
Mhm.
I was wondering if you know much about Mary's mother, Anna.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason I ask, and I don't remember the name, it has Anna in the title, but it was a book written a long time ago about Anna, grandmother. Anna would be grandmother of Yeshua, and how she talked about going to whoever this author was, and I can't get it right now, but she talked about how um, Jesus went to different countries and learned different things and that. And you were talking about the men in the bar mitzvah.
Yeah.
Was there also training for the women going along with Jesus as the apostles, disciples? Did they have training on, because they were young women at the time they were called by Jesus? So did they have training in the same sense of not a bar mitzvah, but something different?
Yeah. So the yes, Anna was and was the grandmother, as you said. I don't
Right.
actually know too much about her historically, but then she had Elizabeth, and Elizabeth and Zachariah were the parents of John the Baptist, and so they were related to Jesus also. The
Okay.
the women in the culture did not receive education or training except from other women and grandmothers about how to run households, how to cook, sew, mend, medicine, all that kind of stuff. But in Yeshua's circle, yes, they studied with him and they studied with the other apostles. They received much of the same spiritual training as the men did. One of the principal exceptions was he did not send them out to do field work, so to speak, to other villages to go teach or whatever, because number one, they weren't allowed to teach in synagogues, even though he would have allowed them to. The synagogue wouldn't have allowed them to. So they couldn't go teach in other synagogues like the men did. And then it wasn't safe. It was much more dangerous. So the women didn't typically take on any of those real visible public roles, which was also partly for safety. But as far as what they studied, yeah, they studied with him too, and he gave them the same kind of training. And a number of them in his circle more than likely learned, how to read and write Hebrew also.
And
And
how to be a woman and how to be a man.
yeah, actually they did. They
Okay, that's what
and
I
the
was.
roles were very well defined back then, unlike
Okay.
yeah, yeah,
Well, no sex to marriage would, be enough right there,
yeah,
but
oh
they would
yeah,
still like be what, engaged, they would call it, maybe. They
yeah.
would
Betrothed. They called it betrothed.
betrothed.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, and that could
yeah,
last anywhere from a few weeks to a couple of years actually, during which time they were not allowed to have sex, but they were considered pledged to each other. And then once they had the wedding feast, then could have they could have sex at that point.
yeah, yeah. That I like that.
Yeah, thanks, Lois. Appreciate it.
Okay, thank you, Stephen.
All righty. Let's see here. Back to you, Ani.
Yeah, I wanted to say that I just didn't want the term bar mitzvah to be interpreted at the same way that it is today. It meant they were then subject to the commandments. It meant that they were, in the sense we think of an adult, they were taking on the responsibility, that they knew the difference between right and wrong, that they had been instructed in how to conduct themselves, both as grown-ups and as responsible people in the religion itself. But it wasn't like they were having lavish parties like they do today.
No, no.
So,
And also at that age, the boys at that age could conduct synagogue services. They could teach in the synagogue at that point as well, and,
and
and, and read
it's
from the Torah and so on, which they couldn't do up to that point.
right. And the idea is, okay, you know what, you know the difference between right and wrong, you know what you should be doing, and so you're responsible for doing it. And it's one of the reasons that in some Christian denominations today they do not do infant baptism, because of the same idea, is you're not old enough to make a decision at that point, and they don't have an immersion service until a child is able to know the difference of what they're doing, like to make their own choice. And that varies anywhere from 7 to 13 or something like that, I think. I don't know all of them, but that's where they get that from. The idea is not that you get to have a party. It's the idea is, you know what you're supposed to be doing. So
Yeah, they weren't having a lot of parties.
And
no,
that, and was that when they were more into learning how to teach if they were to go to synagogue? I mean, I know the women probably weren't, but that's when the men were able to start, because Jesus was what, 13?
Yeah,
and I don't know if it was a formal, okay, you may now start teaching, or I think it was more about you can now speak up and you have something to say because you've had enough instruction that you should have an opinion about it. It isn't a formal,
No, I don't. I
yeah,
mean, they got the, like you said, they have the information, but could they speak up and say what they wanted to in the synagogue before, say, 13? Was
I
that
don't know.
allowed?
I don't know. And
they could.
especially back then, it wasn't a hard and fast rule about, oh, you hit your 13th birthday, now you do this. It,
Okay.
it was more, let's see where you are with your maturity and understanding of the law and understanding of Torah, and see where you are, and what you have to say and whether it makes sense or not. I mean,
Okay.
we
That helps. That
at one
helps.
time we used to have, gosh, this is going way back, when our children were still young, we had Bible study times, Sunday mornings here, and,
Wow.
and the adults were there and the children were there, and there was instruction, and whoever had something to say could speak up and say it. And I'm sure, I mean, I don't I think that's pretty much the way it is in any multi-generational service. You know, some if the child has something germane to the conversation, to the story to add, then respectfully and within the protocols of that particular gathering, I think that that's always welcome. I was very impressed, by the way, by when we would attend the synagogue here in Fort Wayne, um, because Rabbi Fox would always be walking around during the during the sermon, and he would stop and say, "Well, why do we do this?" And he would ask people, and he would ask children just as often, sometimes more often than parents, and they were always eager to show off why they, what they thought about something or what they knew. Why do we do such and such? And they would have a reason. So back to you, Stephen.
Thank you, Annie and Stephen.
All right, thanks. Yeah, anybody else have any questions or things you didn't get to ask about, or I didn't cover? So I hope you're getting something out of this. All right, if nothing else, I'm going to introduce a new topic, still related to the families, but different, not just the women. There's a thing that you're not likely to hear about unless you are involved in following like biblical archaeological research, or those kind of circles. It's definitely not a hidden thing. It's out there, but you're not likely to come across it. The news is not going to talk about this, and You're not likely to see it on the internet unless you belong to some of these places that do research. But I'm going to try something here and see if this works, and you can tell me if it does. I'm going to, hang on one second. I'm going to try a screen share here, and I want to see if you can see it. So do you see a picture now instead of me?
Yes.
Great. Okay, so this is just something I thought you might be interested in, since we're talking about the women and the relationship possibly with Mary Magdalene and Jesus and some of these other stories. This is a tomb in Israel that was found actually a long time ago, but it hasn't made any national news outside of biblical and archaeological circles. It's in a place in Jerusalem called Talpiot, and it was discovered during excavations to build new parts of the city. They discovered this, stopped the building, the antiquities department came in and so on. They opened it up, excavated it. There's this tomb. And unlike the stories you hear in the New Testament where there was a round stone rolled in front of the tomb, almost all first century tombs, they've discovered over 2,000 of them now in Israel from this era, had square blocks like this. And then you can see there's an inset where the wedging stone or block would have been pushed that would have fitted into this indentation and then sealed and made this a relatively airtight, relatively waterproof chamber. And in there was the burial chamber. Now, what most people don't know, and we'll get to how this relates to Yeshua, possibly relates, is that for a very short time in Israel, less than 200 years, and first century was the main part of when this happened, during the life of Yeshua and his apostles, the Jews had a practice of, that will sound a little strange maybe, but they believed, most of them, believed that there would be an end to time or an end to history where God would intervene in the world, and that all souls who had ever lived would be resurrected, good and bad, all of them would be resurrected, and that for God to and have a new resurrected body, and that for God to do that resurrection, the bones had to be kept. The flesh obviously would have rotted away, but the bones had to be kept. So what they did in first century Israel was they would bury a body, and they were usually stone caves like this. Sometimes they were actually cut out of the rock, sometimes they were just caves, but there were so many of them. They used them for this. They would put the body in one of these tombs and seal up the entrance somehow and wait approximately a year and then come back. I want to talk about anointing the body. That was another role women had that I forgot to mention, so let me just mention that real quickly. Judaism then and now has a sacred ritual of anointing the body of the dead. And so in the New Testament, Yeshua is crucified, and because it's Passover and because they're entering into Shabbat also, he could not be left on the cross overnight by Jewish law. So Joseph of Arimathea, this very wealthy guy we talked about before, went to Pilate, with whom he had a lot of influence, got permission to get the body down, and hastily buried it in a tomb nearby. So this was not a Jewish ritual burial. This was, we're putting you in there temporarily because it's Shabbat and we can't bury you and we can't anoint the body. So he wasn't officially buried. They had to come back and perhaps leave him there, perhaps move him to a different tomb, but they had to do the ritual preparation of the body, which included a lot of spices, myrrhs, frankincense, different oils, that they would clean the body first, and his body was in wretched condition from the flogging and the sweat and the beatings and the blood. And so he would have had to be thoroughly cleaned, and then his body would have been anointed with all these various spices, and then he would have been buried with certain prayers. So that's why the women were going back on what we now call Easter morning.
Sorry, I was having trouble hearing.
Oh, okay.
Coming up to here.
So that's why the women were going back, was to anoint the body and do this ritual proper burial. So what happens was all of these bodies then were kept in these tombs, and a year or two later, they would come back and collect the bones and put them in something called an ossuary. It was a little box, usually made out of stone. Richer families made them out of marble. And they would keep those bones there until the resurrection came. And then because they had all the bones, that person could be resurrected. But if you didn't have all the bones, couldn't be resurrected. So even now, in like when Israel is at war, it's a big deal to get the bodies back, and to have to have the blood. And hang on just a second. Sorry. Give me just a second. I need to fix something here. Hold on. I'll be back. Alrighty, so anyway, that was a picture of this tomb that they found. And the interesting part about all that is that families would have burial tombs, kind of like families now have grave sites, or more like families that have mausoleums now. And in this, okay, sorry, one more technical problem. Hang on. So in this tomb, these ossuary boxes that were, like a few feet by a few feet, like maybe 2 feet by 18 inches or 3 feet by 18 inches. They're relatively small. They just have to hold bones. They would inscribe the name of the person on the outside of them, typically in Aramaic. So they found this tomb, and in this tomb there were 10 of these ossuary boxes. And every one of the 10 had names inscribed on it that were all members of Yeshua's family that we know from the New Testament. That's really, really unusual. Now, you might think that those are all common names because they were. Mary's common name, Jude's common name, Simon, James, they're all common names. That's true. And out of over 2,000 ossuaries that they've discovered so far from ancient Israel during this time period, they've never found one with this collection of names, ever, so far. So that's unusual. So a lot of archaeologists, and particularly biblical archaeologists, are excited about, could this actually be Yeshua's family's tomb? Is that possible? And the answer is, well, yeah, it's possible. But is it that? Well, maybe, maybe not. They've submitted these names to a very famous statistician from the University of Toronto, and his research said that even though these names are common names back in that time, all of them being found together in one tomb, that it's approximately 1 in a million odds. So, that's unusual. The other very unusual part, connecting back again to the stories we've been telling about Mary, maybe Magdalene being Yeshua's wife. One of the names is on there is Mary Amne, and it's a Greek form of the word Mary. And in the Gospels outside the New Testament, like the Gospel of Philip, also in the writings of Origen, and in some other non-biblical writings, Mary Magdalene is referred to by that name, by that Greek name. So a lot of scholars believe this is Mary Magdalene, and that she was in that tomb, if this was in fact Yeshua's family's tomb, because she was married to him and became part of the family. So in that tomb, just briefly, and I don't know that it is, nobody knows whether it is or isn't, but highly unlikely coincidences. So in the ossuary, there's an ossuary that's named Maria, but it's not the Miriamne, which is the Greek form of Mary Magdalene. So the guess by the archaeologists, if this is the family tomb, is that would have been the mother. Anyway, that would have been the mother. There's also one named Yosef, which is one of Jesus' brothers in the New Testament. There's also one that says, curiously enough, Judah, son of Jesus, or in Aramaic it says Yehuda bar Yeshua. Well, you remember the oral story I told you about from England and France, that they had a son, Mary Magdalene and Jesus, whose name was Judah. This ossuary says, this is Judah, the son of Jesus. So, you know, this is remarkable coincidence or something really significant, but at least it's interesting coincidence. Also, there's one in there that actually says Yeshua bar Yosef, which means Jesus, son of Joseph. So that's intriguing to Christian scholars, because what if this actually is the bones of Jesus? Because that wouldn't fit with any of their theology. I don't know how you'd ever prove that, but interesting idea. And perhaps the most interesting thing about all of this so far, at least to me, is that they found one. As you probably know by now, they identify people as son of, son of Joseph, son of Jesus, son of whatever, and or by the region they come from. They never identify people by sibling relationship. But in this, there's also an ossuary that says Yaakov ben Yosef Achui de Yeshua, which means, in English, Jesus, the son of Joseph, the brother of Jesus. So that's interesting, because we know a lot about James, the brother of Jesus, and what part he played in the ministry and what he did after Jesus' death, which maybe we can do a series on that sometime, because it's really interesting. But again, very unusual to have one that says brother of anybody. So if you're going to put brother of somebody, it's going to be somebody really important or well-known or prominent. So James's ossuary says he was the son of Joseph, which would have been true in the Jesus case, and the brother of Yeshua or Jesus. So just little intriguing things. And so if that's that may be totally uninteresting to you, but I thought it was fascinating. And if you're interested in looking up things like that, it's called the Talpiot, Talpiot, Talpiot tomb. And you can find it really easily on the internet with lots of information. And then if you want to find out more about the Marys and more about some of the early stories, there's a researcher, biblical researcher, one of the New Testament scholars that's considered one of the best in the world. His name is Dr. James Tabor, Tabor. He has a website, he has blogs, he has all kinds of things. You can look him up if you're interested too. And he has a lot of information on the Marys. He has a lot of information on early history, on the development of the Gospels, on the non-biblical things. He's very involved. He's been to Israel, I think, 75 times. He's involved in a lot of the archaeological digs and discoveries, and publishes that stuff. So if you're at all interested in that aspect, he's a good resource. And anyway, I thought you might find some of that interesting. There's also a documentary, if you can find it, on PBS or anywhere these days, done several years ago. It's called The Lost Tomb of Jesus, and it's by one of the men who found it and filmed it, and they they cataloged everything. They filmed it. They did sketches, lots of interesting things. All of that stuff is in the Israeli museum in Israel now. So that's just a few interesting things. The other thing that they did that was interesting to me also, this Miriamne, who they think might have been Mary Magdalene, buried in this tomb, and the bones of Yeshua, which might have been Yeshua's bones, if any of that's accurate. They did DNA testing, believe it or not. And the DNA testing of Miriamne and Yeshua showed no familiar connections whatsoever, which the other bones did. The Judah, son of Jesus, had the same DNA as the Jesus bones, and so on. The one that didn't was her, which she wouldn't have if she were actually his wife. But again, that doesn't mean it was these people that we're studying, but it's a really outstanding coincidence. And it's got scholars all stirred up. Some of them really hopeful that they'll find more information and actually be able to prove this probably was the family of Jesus' tomb, and that he's actually buried there, which would, throw a lot of things topsy-turvy. And a lot of people really adamantly opposed to proving that it's not that. And there's a lot of vested interest in believers on all sides. But the archaeologists and the actual biblical researchers are just trying to piece together what they find and see what they, and then present what they find and leave it to people to decide what they want to believe. So I thought that was interesting. But families did have these places back then where they buried people together, and the description in the New Testament, why they put them in tombs, was well known back then. They didn't need to write about that. But now we don't know that anymore. We don't know they saved the bones in the hope of the resurrection and so on. So if you're all interested in that, you can. They have lots of. They also have found. We'll bring us to a close here in a moment. They've also found, just another piece of history, Caiaphas, the high priest. They have found, and there aren't any scholars at this point that dissent from this opinion. They found the ossuary of Caiaphas in a very rich tomb. They found his house, very massive, elegant mansion. They found the house of Simon Peter, and they found the synagogue, the original synagogue at Capernaum, where Yeshua and the apostles taught from time to time. So all those archaeologically have been found, and those are the undisputed ones. They found a lot of ones that people have opinions about that other researchers don't agree with, but those are all pretty widely accepted now. So it's interesting that they're unearthing, to me it's interesting that they're unearthing a lot of this stuff. And so much of it is in alignment with the stories in the New Testament that concur with the timing and the peoples and the position and whatnot that were described there. So anyway, alrighty. So I want to mention two quick things, and we'll wrap this up tonight. Tomorrow, Michael and I are doing one of our classes at Unity at 10 in the morning. You're on Sacred Relationship. You're welcome to join us there. Also, this Sunday, I'm the guest speaker at the Unity Church here again, so you're certainly welcome to join me there. Their service is at 10:30. And do we have anything else we need to announce?
That's it.
I think that's it. So I think that's it for our announcements. So I'd like to just take a moment of quiet with you and sort of come back into that peaceful state, because I know a lot of this stirs up mental things and thoughts and ideas and questions and maybe some emotional things. So let's just come back into that quiet place again for a moment and just sort of take that all in, whatever it was. And if there's something that's helpful to you, then hang on to that. And if there's not, then just let that drift away. So once again, I just appreciate your being here and supporting this and being with us tonight. We'll have one more kind of wrap up next week on this, and then we'll probably move on to a new topic for the next series. Hope you can be here next week too. Don't know what the next series will be yet. If any of you have any ideas of things you really like me to cover that you think I'm capable of covering, send me an email. Let me know, and I'll consider those. Otherwise, I'll come up with the next one. I have a lot of things in the works, but I haven't decided yet what to do next. So if you have something in particular interested in, please let me know. And thanks so much. These are recorded and available on our YouTube channel. If you don't have that and want to, just send me an email. We'll tell you how to connect to it. So in the meantime, hope to see some of you this weekend. God bless. I hope you have a wonderful, safe week, and that all of us continue to grow in our wisdom and in our compassion. Thank you all. Bye for now.